As the 41st millennium drew to its close, it became clear that the existence of the Imperium of Man was threatened from every side, by enemies old and new. Psychic oracles across the galaxy all predicted disaster. One of these, a seer named Tagarath of Corinto, foresaw a new era of upheaval. He claimed that both the Imperium and the Emperor's light would be swallowed by a darkness approaching from the galaxy's edge. Though Tagarath was executed by the imperial authorities for heresy, and his prophecies suppressed by the Inquisition, his visions of disaster proved prescient. So it was that later imperial savants marked the 745th year of the 41st millennium as the start of a period remembered as the time of ending. Only a few years prior, the Imperium had made contact with a new humanoid alien species that had begun to move into Imperial territory in the Eastern Fringe of the galaxy. Known as the Tau, they had established trade agreements with Imperial worlds on the frontier, near the starless gap of the Damocles Gulf. The Tau were a technologically advanced species, and trade and commerce soon flourished between their worlds and those of humanity. The Imperium had actually made contact with the Tau in the late 35th millennium. A Mechanicus explorator ship, the Land's Vision, discovered the Tau homeworld, which bore the same name as its natives. The Tau of that time were a Stone Age people who had barely mastered simple tools and the command of fire. Before the Imperials decided what should be done with the alien population, a violent warp storm erupted around the planet. The explorators were forced to flee the system, and the wars of the Age of Apostasy prevented any follow-up expeditions. Humanity quickly forgot about the Tau, leaving their civilization to develop in peace and isolation. Over the next 6,000 years, the Tau evolved rapidly into a powerful spacefaring culture. The original Tau had been hunter-gatherers who lived a nomadic existence as mobile tribes on their homeworld's vast, arid plains. But some of these tribes adapted to different environments, sometimes even changing physically. The Tau of the mountains grew bat-like flaps of skin and developed lightweight bones that allowed them to float above their world on thermal drafts. The Tau of the fertile river valleys discovered agriculture and metallurgy, establishing the first towns and true civilizations. The birth of settlements led to trade, and groups of wandering Tau began to mediate commercial disputes between the tribes. They traveled up and down the rivers in crude barges, serving as their people's diplomats and merchants. Those Tau who remained hunters on the plains grew to become skillful trackers and warriors, larger and physically stronger than the others. Unfortunately, the rapid cultural, biological, and technological changes Tau society was undergoing led to conflict between the tribes. It was not long before the Tau peoples were at each other's throats, fighting over resources and their different approaches to life. This changed with the coming of the fifth group of Tau, who called themselves the Ethereals. Later legends claim that the Ethereals first appeared at the besieged city of Fiaw Town after strange lights were seen in the skies. Fiaw Town was a fortress city that had been under siege by the fierce Tau Plains warriors for 5 local years. It was at this time that 2 mysterious Tau appeared. One made his way into the camp of the Plains Tau, while the other entered the besieged fortress. Both exuded a quiet authority that no Tau seemed able to resist. Within a few short hours, the gates of Fiaw Town swung open, and both sides were ready to talk. The Ethereals spoke of the importance of peace and understanding between all Tau. They described a new conception of existence they called the greater good, an ideal that all Tau must strive to achieve. The greater good required putting the collective needs of their species ahead of their own selfish desires. The besiegers and besieged, apparently spellbound by the presence of the ethereals, agreed, and a truce was quickly achieved. Across the Tau homeworld, other ethereals emerged, each with the same authority and message of cooperation and peace. Within a few local years, the ethereals had reshaped Tau society in service to the greater good. The distinct Tau cultures were transformed into 4 castes, each of which served a different need. The Fire caste were the warriors drawn from the plains. The Earth caste, the former city Tau, who now served as craftsmen and scientists. The Water caste, the traders, who had become Tau merchants and diplomats. And the Air caste were the mountain Tau, who became first messengers and eventually the crews of their people's starfaring fleets. With the idea of the greater good to guide them, and the ethereals to unite them, the Tau advanced rapidly. By the late 41st millennium, they had become a starfaring species that crossed the void of the eastern region of the galaxy known as the Damocles Gulf, and absorbed several other intelligent species into their empire. The greater good and the technological bounty it seemed to produce proved equally attractive to many of the imperial worlds the Tau began to trade with. The Inquisition became suspicious that many of these human colonies were looking to secede from the Emperor's domain and join the Tau Empire. Such heresy could not be allowed. Designating the Tau a major threat, an imperial military campaign, the Damocles Crusade, was launched in the Eastern Fringe. Its purpose was to purge the Tau from existence and prevent them from laying claim to imperial territory. The Crusade, made up of a dozen Imperial Navy capital ships, 5 companies of Space Marines, and 19 Astra Militarum regiments, first moved on the Timbra subsector, where human colonists had chosen to coexist with the Tau. The Crusade brutally re-established imperial authority on the Garrus and Kleist colonies which had openly joined the Tau Empire. It then moved on and engaged the Tau directly, for the first time in a naval battle in the Hydas system. Though the Imperials proved victorious, they were surprised at the tenacity and technological skill of the Tau Navy. The Crusade at first found little resistance after they crossed the Damocles Gulf in 5 solar months and entered Tau space proper. But when the fleet reached the Tau world of Dalith, it suffered terrible casualties against the Tau Navy and its savage crewed allies during fighting in space. It lost 4 capital ships and 14 escorts. The planetary assault proceeded little better, as the sheer numbers of the Tau forces and the firepower provided by the elite-powered crisis battlesuits frustrated all Imperial attempts to finish off their opponents and seize the world. After gaining a new respect for the Tau, the Crusade's commanders were ready to request needed reinforcements to complete the conquest of Dalith. But it was then that orders arrived from the Inquisitor Lord Fetus Cryptman to return to Imperial space to deal with the imminent Tyranid invasion. The Tau recognized that it would be wise to get the humans to vacate their territory without further bloodshed. Water caste diplomats managed to negotiate a truce with the battered Imperials, and the Crusade withdrew from Tau space. The Tau had learned that the galaxy would not fall easily to the greater good. Yet the Imperium realized to its shock that it faced a competitor for the allegiance of human worlds in the galaxy for the first time since the Great Crusade. However, the threat of the Tau Empire would have to wait. Cryptman had recalled the Imperial fleet for good reason. The Tyranid fleet he had discovered at Tyran had been advancing with unprecedented speed deeper into the galaxy. Leaving Tyran behind, he sought to send an astropathic message warning of the Tyranid invasion through a telepathic matrix located at the world of Thandros. The matrix could boost astropathic signals, allowing him to get his message to Terra. But the message failed to transmit, and when Kryptman arrived at Thandros, he found it already devoured by the voracious aliens. In desperation, Kryptman salvaged the matrix and sent his report to Terra, accompanied by the record of what had happened at Tyran. The Ordo Xenos acknowledged the message and ordered the Inquisitor to travel to the Ultramarines chapter's homeworld of Macragge. He was to assist them in mounting a defense against the horrors to come. Kryptman was also informed that in keeping with Imperial tradition, the alien Hive Fleet had been given a code name drawn from a legendary beast of old Earth, Behemoth. The man who would face Hive Fleet Behemoth was Marneus Augustus Calgar, the chapter master of the Ultramarines. Within a vault in the Ultramarines' fortress monastery on Macragge were records detailing the deeds of the greatest space marines of the chapter. 28 volumes were devoted to Calgar, twice the number earned by any other living Ultramarine. His skill and achievements were unsurpassed in the chapter's long history, save for those of its primarch, Rabute Guilliman himself. Predicting the Behemoth's likely trajectory, an Ultramarines force first faced the Tyranids at the agro-world of Prandium. Despite a heroic effort, the Ultramarines were overwhelmed by the aliens' sheer numbers. Prandium, once considered one of the most beautiful worlds in the Imperium, was reduced to a lifeless husk. With this experience, Calgar concluded that to beat the Tyranids, the Ultramarines and their allies would have to adapt and develop new strategies and tactics not necessarily in the sacred text of Guilliman's Codex Astartes. The Space Marines' traditional hit-and-run raids would have to be abandoned in place of concentrated defenses and static firepower. This meant that they would have to choose a place to defend. Calgar decided on the great fortresses that existed at Macragge's north and south poles. Warned of the impending attack by Kryptman, the Ultramarines had reinforced their homeworld's already formidable defenses. Above Macragge, a massive battle fleet had been assembled. It included the Ultramarines' own battle barges, orbital starforts, the heavy cruisers of the Ultramar Defense Fleet, and a ragtag collection of nearly every space-worthy vessel in the chapter's realm of Ultramar. If the Behemoth could not be stopped in the void, Calgar intended for Macragge's defenders to retreat to the polar fortresses and hold out until Imperial reinforcements arrived. Whatever happened, Macragge could not be allowed to fall. When the Hive Fleet arrived in the system, it proved undaunted by the world's potent orbital defenses. While the defenders destroyed countless waves of bioships, the sheer numbers of the alien invaders were overwhelming, just as they had been at Prandium. With every wave, more mycetic spores carrying Tyranid warrior forms broke through to fall in blazing wakes to Macragge's surface. The Ultramarines' first chaplain, Ortan Cassius, who had defeated the Genestealer Patriarch at Gosar Quintus before they knew that the Genestealers were Tyranid organisms, helped Calgar draw up his defenses. The chapter master divided his ground forces into 3 armies. The primary and secondary task forces, composed of the chapter's elite First Company and the ordinary humans of the Ultramar Auxiliary Planetary Defense Forces, would defend the polar fortresses, while Calgar led the largest task force made up of the Ultramarines' Second Company and elements of the 1st, 5th, and 10th Companies in rearguard attacks. These would attempt to slow the Tyranid advances and buy time for the veterans of the First Company to enhance the defenses of the polar fortresses. The Ultramarines' force succeeded in slowing down the Tyranids' advance across the world for some time. But even with a commander of Calgar's skill, the Imperials could only delay the oncoming horde. When Genestealers infiltrated the Sirocco starport and killed most of Calgar's transport pilots, he decided to make a final stand at Cold Steel Ridge. Cold Steel Ridge was an industrial complex located on the coast of the northern Arctic region, the final obstacle the Tyranids needed to overcome before reaching the polar fortress. It was defended by a company of Ultramar auxiliaries in a Baneblade super heavy tank before being joined by Calgar and his surviving Space Marines. By this point, the Hive Mind had determined that Marneus Calgar represented the linchpin of the Imperial defense. To remove him, it created a new Tyranid warrior form known as the Swarmlord. The Swarmlord was more independent of the Hive Mind's mental control than most Tyranid organisms. In reality, it contained the sum total of Tyranid combat experience earned over the millions of years of the Tyranid race's existence. When slain, its experiences simply returned to the Hive Mind to eventually be granted to its next incarnation. The arrival of this unique creature proved the turning point in the battle for Cold Steel Ridge. Though the defenders had begun to learn how to defeat the Tyranids' near-mindless tactics, the Swarmlord's influence infused them with new and unexpected skill. The Swarmlord laid a trap that allowed it to face Calgar while his warriors were delayed elsewhere by a force of Tyranids that had pretended at first to be slain. Even the mighty Chapter Master proved to be no match for the embodiment of the Tyranid species' collective memory. Badly wounded, he was saved only by the actions of his honor guard and delivered to the Imperial fleet in orbit. The path to the polar fortress had been cleared. While the ground battle proceeded, Macragge's orbital defenses had been all but destroyed. Despite his injuries, Calgar took command of the remaining Imperial fleet and coordinated targeted raids on the Tyranid bioships as they surrounded the planet. However, having delivered their deadly cargoes, the bioships broke out of orbit in an attempt to lure the Imperial fleet away from Macragge into the ringed world of Circe on the system's edge. The Tyranids had a second fleet concealed among Circe's rings and sprung their trap as soon as the Imperials reached the planet. But at the same time, over 200 warships of the Imperial Navy's Battle Fleet Tempestus suddenly emerged into real space. The Tyranids were caught between the two Imperial forces, but the sheer size of the Behemoth's fleet slowly started to chip away at the Imperial advantage of surprise. Facing disaster, the great Emperor-class battleship Dominus Astra slammed into the heart of the Great Devourer's fleet and detonated its warp drive. This unleashed the cataclysm of a local warp rift that sucked both the battleship and the entire Tyranid fleet into oblivion in the warp. Though splinter fleets would remain, the void battle at Circe effectively ended what would be remembered as the First Tyrannic War. Calgar and his Space Marines rushed back to Macragge with a relief force for the polar fortresses. Ortan Cassius accompanied the task force that cleared out the northern polar fortress. Without further reinforcements from their Hive fleet, all of the Tyranids were eventually slain. Though part of the southern fortress's garrison survived, every Space Marine in the northern polar fortress, the entire First Company, had been killed to the last man. Cassius was badly wounded during the battles to reclaim the fortresses, and only clung to life by the slimmest of margins until his body could be extensively rebuilt with cybernetics. As soon as he was fit, he requested permission to create a new unit of Tyranid hunters known as the Tyrannic War Veterans. Though Hive Fleet Behemoth had been destroyed, it would take years for all the remaining bioforms to be scoured from Macragge and over 100 years for the Ultramarines to replace all their losses. The Swarmlord was officially listed as slain during the final assault on the northern polar fortress, but no corpse was ever found. The Imperium reeled from the implications of the Tyranid assault. The aliens had almost destroyed one of the noblest first founding Space Marine chapters. The Inquisition calculated that another Hive Fleet assault, which was certain to come, could lead to the extinction of mankind itself. And it was then, in this moment of bleakest despair, that the Imperium's oldest enemy prepared to launch the greatest campaign of his long war. The 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler was about to begin.